start the talk. I don't know if they're going to grab the doors or not, but cool. Thanks very much for that. So hello everyone. My name's Adrian Kovich. I'm from Semantic.cloud. I hope you're all having a very good symposium today. There's been a lot of interesting talks, and I hope this is one of those. So, as I said, I'm from the Semantic.cloud division of Semantic. So, for those of you who do or don't notice, we came be part of Semantic as part of the Message Labs acquisition. I think 3 years ago now. So, I work with that team. Our portfolio has expanded quite greatly since then, and I guess one of those aspects will be what I'm talking about today. So, you know, the title of the presentation is "Your After Hours Browsing Habits Revealed. Are You Protected?" So, quite a relevant and current topic at the moment. So, I hope you find it of interest. So, I guess to go through the agenda for today, we're going to, I guess, take a brief look at the mobile phenomenon. I know that's been the subject of a lot of the talks that Semantics put on today, and really is, I guess, a catchword and certainly a current topic of debate and a current challenge in the security and the identification and the storage sphere. I guess where we're going to be talking today is we're looking at the implications of that mobility on security and policy and what challenges it brings, and I guess opening our eyes a little bit to really what happens or how the game has changed now that people are moving with their PCs, now that people are taking their laptops home and so on. So really looking at, well, what challenges does that throw to us? And what are the best countermeasures in terms of that? So again, hopefully it's an entertaining talk for you all. So a little bit about Semantic.cloud. Again, I mentioned before that we became part of the Semantic family during the Message Labs acquisition. Primarily, we're all about email, but now as part of the Semantic family, we do a lot more than that. We're effectively the cloud platform, which Semantic is delivering a lot of services. And one of those I'll be talking about today is web filtering, and the other is around endpoint protection. So I guess to give you a snapshot of our reach and our scale, we currently service around 10 million users on our global infrastructure. So that's scanning mail, that's scanning web, that's scanning endpoint and so on, and around 31,000 clients across our 14 data centers around the world. So I want to, I guess, set the scene and talk a little bit about where we get a lot of the data I'm talking about today. So one of Semantic.cloud's products is what we call our Web Security.cloud product. And basically what that is a proxy in the sky. So we've got a large amount of infrastructure. So traditionally what you'd be doing is putting a proxy in-house to do things like acceptable use policy and filtering and logging, things like that. What we've done, and I guess how we've revolutionised this market, is very similar to the way we've done for email. We've put that in the cloud. So that has a whole heap of advantages, and the advantages are around things like being able to do much better virus checking. So proxy traditionally may do virus checking, doing a lot better virus checking, doing a lot better inspection of traffic, bringing in intelligence from that network around the world, so not just making decisions based on what an appliance sees, we're actually doing that, making these decisions on what malware is and so on, based on seeing somewhere around 2 billion web connections per day, and being able to then provide the ability for multi-tenanted, or I should say, businesses that have multiple offices, for instance, where they can connect into the same platform, managed the same way, etc. But one of the key things, I guess, part of what I'll be talking about today is around the roaming aspect. So that's actually taking the whole thing a step further and saying, well, no matter where that PC goes, no matter how it connects to the internet, we're going to make sure that its web connections are proxied through the semantic network. So what that means is we're going to be able to do things like acceptable use policy, we're going to be able to do logging, and we're going to be able to do antivirus filtering, again, no matter where that computer goes. And as I talk today, that'll become quite apparent how important that is when we look at, well, what happens to PCs when they're off the network? What happens when they're no longer behind a corporate proxy in a traditional sense? So I've got a few slides here, I guess, around the mobile workforce. Again, it's been a very hot topic across Semantic. we all know that laptops are becoming the platform du jour for people in terms of their work platforms as opposed to a desktop machine. I guess you've all seen the statistics that come from manufacturers that say, well, we ship 2 or 3 laptop PCs for every desktop PC to a corporate environment. So it's certainly something that's coming in, something that's coming along, and we see a lot more people taking their laptops home and using them at home. I guess as I talk a little bit more about that level of connectivity and security behind them, it becomes very important that sort of aspect be protected as well. And again, that's only set to grow. So laptops, mobile in general is set to stay. And I won't linger too much on that topic because I think it's a fairly self-evident one. But what isn't though is the security aspects to this, right? So again, look at a typical environment, a typical corporate environment where you'll have, from a web perspective, a proxy that sits in the firewall. You have IDSs, you'll have firewalls and so on, whose job it is to make sure that web surfing, for example, is safe. So when you're inside the network, it does things like making sure you can't go to porn sites, which is kind of an obvious one. It does things like logging though. So it sets up an acceptable usage policy and will say, well, you're not allowed to go to these particular sites, and if you do go to them as an abuse, we're going to know about that. And they also do things like malware filtering as well. Now, that's fine when you're in the office. And again, your computer's hooked up to that blue cable, and the blue cable sits back to the computer, and your network goes through the work gateway. But if you're like me, and again, those slides that I showed earlier, that's not where your machine spends its entire time. That blue cable is not the only place that it gets network information from. So compare that to when I take my computer home, over here, I plug it into my home broadband, or I go to the Golden Arches and plug into their wireless. I no longer have that protection that I had back here. I no longer have that firewall, I no longer have the proxy and so on. Unless I go to the effort of setting up VPNs, and 3/4 of the time that may not work and they're always optional. What I do here is going to be very separate in terms of protection and policy to what I did back in the office. Now that may sound all very benign, and that may sound like, well, what happens at home stays at home, but when we start talking about viruses, and when we start talking about violation of acceptable usage policy, that is a big deal. And the reason why is because the next morning I come back into the office and I plug my computer in. Now during that time, all of my usage hasn't been filtered, so again, if there was malware, I may have downloaded it. If I'd gone to inappropriate sites, I may have brought those on my machine as well, and I've brought them back in the network. So they haven't gone through the firewall, they haven't gone through all the conventional offences, and effectively they're like the original Trojan horse, if you like. They've come back into the network, and have access to the network as if they were always there. And there's also some sort of more subtle aspects to the acceptable usage policies. So, if you're like me, when I signed on to Semantics some time ago now, the acceptable usage policy related to how I use my computer and how I use Semantics resources. And it's the same everywhere else I've worked in, no doubt in a standard acceptable usage policy. But that does apply to where I go. It does apply to where I take my machine. And as a company, they're obligated to make sure that they can uphold that acceptable usage policy. And while I'm off the network, in a traditional sense, a company may not be able to do that. And then there's a whole discussion about antivirus as well, and I'll go into that in further detail as we go along. So the first thing I want to talk about is the web as a risk vector. So you've probably all seen, I imagine there would have been talks today around the web, so I'm not going to make this about a sort of a pantheon of viruses over the web, but I want to make it clear that the web is a vector for viruses. You can see here these sort of stats we talk about where you can see there's a very clear trend over the last couple of years for the web to be an increasing method to deliver a virus. And so there's a couple of reasons for that. I won't bore you with all of them, but one of them is around the fact that it's a much easier to control, much more useful tool as a virus writer than, say, an email attachment. There's a very simple reason for that. It's because if I send you let's say, an infected PDF file, I send it to you as a virus writer, and it's got some intelligence that'll go and send it to 5 of your friends, and then it'll send. Eventually, an antivirus program along the way is going to catch that file. Be it at the first step, be it at the second step, be it at the 10th step, even if you're really smart and get around it. But I've lost control of that. I can no longer have real control of that file because it's been sent in a method that is effectively gone from me. But if I write a web page, or I hijack someone else's web page and put some code on it that I then subsequently control, and then send an email to a person with a link to that web page, I maintain control of that delivery mechanism the whole time. So you know what? If an antivirus program picks that code up and works out that it's a virus, I still have control of it. So I can update my code to make that vector. So vector's still useful, and I can also keep track of how well this is distributed, how many hits I'm getting, and so on. The second aspect is that there's so many new platforms now. So if you look at the ISTR from Symantec recently, the number of vulnerabilities that exist inside a typical web browsing environment are very high. They're all free programs, all these plugins are all free programs. So when we start talking about all the different active components, they all have their own vulnerabilities from time to time. And there's always new ones coming out. So from a virus writer's perspective, it's simply very easy to be able to pick one and deliver your virus that way, rather than, again, over a more traditional method like SMTP. So I guess there's that part of it, and I guess I've got a couple examples here around valid websites that have been hacked. And these are both, one was in April, one was in February, and I didn't spend a lot of time pulling up examples because we've probably seen a lot of those ourselves. But here are examples of non-nefarious. So one's an Australian university, one's an international stock exchange, one of the bigger ones in Europe, that have actually been hacked to serve malware. And it's a good example of what I've said before. So as a vector, go to those sites, they take advantage of, some vulnerabilities, and they're able to deliver malware. So I guess looking at that, and I guess that all sounds great in theory, but as I mentioned before, Symantec.cloud actually does web filtering in real time and does it for around 200,000 people in the eastern states of Australia. So we thought, well, actually, why don't we look at the traffic that's actually happening through our network? So why don't we actually look at some stats behind that? Because conventional theory would say that if you look at all the defenses that are put in place in work hours, so the firewalls, the IDS, and so on, one would expect that the threat during that time must be higher than the threat outside work hours, because the defenses that are put in place are a lot smaller. But is that the case? So we actually ran some stats on that again and looked at the patterns. So if we ignore the first hour of the day, and there's a whole heap of reasons for that that I'll talk about in a minute, the actual trend is the same. The percentage of hits that are to malicious sites are from the period of 10 through to, well, the next day are the same. But the countermeasures that are put in place are much different. And these are just from Symantec.cloud customers. The threat is the same throughout the day. So people are taking their computers home, they are going to sites that are infected, and they may or may not be infected by those, depending on if they're using our service or not. But the countermeasures are different. And I guess the point of that story is that people should be protected no matter where they are. So then we thought, well, actually, that's the virus side, and I've spent a fair bit of time talking about that. What about the policy side? So again, most businesses, when you sign up, you have an acceptable usage policy, and that acceptable usage policy covers work assets, so laptop, machine. Now, they don't just do that because they may be puritanical or whatever. There's actually a good reason for that. And the reason is around, well, the company has an acceptable usage policy because of duty of care. They also have sexual harassment and so on, problems, concerns as well. And they don't want to have things like copyrighted material and so on. So I'll go into that in a little more detail as we go along, but the point of the story is if people use that outside work hours, they're still bound by the acceptable usage policy. But also, they may bring that stuff back into the network. And so if it's inside their temporary internet cache and so on, it's actually still inside the network. So with that in mind, we thought again we'd look at some real world examples. So here's a couple. Again, I didn't spend a lot of time researching these because there's plenty of examples. The first one is quite a comical one. I think the guy that got fired for a public service job for some web surfing at home. So he took a work computer home and it breached the guidelines of that government department. He was Googling knockers. He swore that he was actually looking for door ornaments. In actual fact, he took a very long way to get there, and had plenty of evidence that he's not very good at finding that kind of knockers, but he was actually fired for that. So, and that was completely outside work hours. Another example is a particular hotel chain that found that such a large proportion of their web traffic was porn, frankly. and it was costing them that much money every night in broadband costs for porn that they took the active step as a commercial decision to block that, and it saved them a large amount of money. So there wasn't even a duty of care side. I think they physically was a money decision. So these threats are real. So we thought, all right, well, again, given the traffic that we see, we actually notice that 35% of people who are on our service trigger more blocks. So in other words, they do 35% of people do significantly more things that are banned by corporate policy outside the network than inside the network. And that's for organisations that actively block that using our service. But there are plenty who don't. So we actually thought we'd go a little bit further and examine, well, in organisations where they do allow this, or where carte blanche is given, what do people do outside work hours? So again, we took the 200,000 users and we picked the entire month of July. We narrowed them down to AEST people, so Australian Eastern Standard Time, and again looked at a number of key categories of web browsing based on hits, so attempts to access sites. So, well, is there a difference between inside and outside work hours? So the first one was adult sexually explicit. So again, it's all kind of funny and whatnot, but the actual